So after weeks, actually months and years of rumors, we have finally had the big announcement from Apple. They are breaking up with Intel and switching to their own Apple silicon processors. I'm Jason Cipriani with Jason Perlow. And today we're going to dive into Apple Silicon and what it means for the future of Mac. So Jason, what exactly was the announcement?
It's not you, Intel, it's me.
Right, yeah, exactly. We have better performance. That's essentially what it came down to.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So they announced that they're moving to their own A series of ARM-based processors for the Mac lineup. It's a transition that will take a couple of years, according to Apple CEO Tim Cook, but we should see our first Mac with Apple Silicon, which is what they're calling it, with an Apple Silicon processor by the end of 2020. We don't know what it's going to look like.
No, they
Laptop.
haven't actually showed us the systems architecture of the actual chip that the first product will land on. I think that's an important key thing to understand. We know that they're going to use the same basic A series architecture that we've seen in iPads and iPhones, right? The very first developer system that's going to ship is going to be an A12Z based system in a Mac Mini chassis for developers. So, and that's not, you can't even buy it, right? You're getting it on loan for $500 for a year, and then you have to give it back. They don't want developers keeping an iPad processor, Mac, and for $500. You're going to have, so the actual chip that we think that's coming could be significantly more powerful than what's they're shipping to developers, right?
Oh,
So,
absolutely, yeah.
what the as I understand, this A12Z I think is a quad processor, and it's it's got a certain clock rate, but we could see an 8-core or 16-core chip, coming out, a significantly more powerful, or multiple A series processors in an SMP configuration. We don't really know exactly what it's going to look like 100%. GPU may be integrated on the chip and may be discrete. Any number of things that they could do with it, in terms of a release box, so.
Yeah, absolutely. So they've switched to this ARM-based architecture. Does some big changes compared to what Intel architecture was. So developers are going to have to do quite a bit of work, and you kind of talked about it just a second ago. Developers can pay $500, get a Mac Mini that has the A12 processor in it. It's the same one that's in the current 2020 iPad Pro as well, but it's running Mac OS Big Sur, which is Mac OS 11 now. Got rid of the 10.16, 15, whatever it was.
20 years, they finally ditched the 10.
Yep, yeah, they finally got rid of it, and we're actually on Mac OS 11. And so that developer kit actually is arriving this week to some developers, and I would imagine there's a hefty NDA attached to it. So we probably won't get a lot of information from developers that actually land one of those machines, but there's a lot of work to be done in order to get apps and programs to work properly on an Apple Silicon Mac, right?
That is true. So, I was actually surprised by just how thorough a port of Mac OS this was. So when I did my prediction article about a week ago, I thought there were going to be a lot more restrictions as to what developers were allowed to do. Right? My main thought was that Cocoa, the main Apple Macintosh API, that developers that such as Microsoft and Adobe use, and Apple uses for themselves for things like Final Cut Pro and Logic Pro, these big honking Mac apps, right, that use Cocoa, would not necessarily be, those APIs and libraries would not necessarily be usable by developers. Right. Yeah. And I didn't think that necessarily side-loading apps would be possible. I think they were going to put it all on the App Store. As it turned out, they didn't do that. They allowed all the Cocoa apps to APIs apparently to be used in libraries. I mean, we're going to see from the developer session today what the actual deal is with those. They didn't really cover that in detail last night for the State of the Union. But it looks like there are all those things that that is used to write Microsoft Office, Adobe Photoshop, those big important pro apps. Those will all be portable. In addition to that, all of the iPad and iPhone apps will be able to run in a native execution environment that essentially emulates the iPad and the iPhone. So if you are a developer and you have an iPad app and you've written an iPad app, All you have to do is say, yeah, I'm going to allow this to be turned on in the App Store for the Mac, and bam, it runs on the Mac. You do nothing, right?
Yeah, well, you had to have over the last couple of years stayed current with best practices with
Yes.
storyboards and window resize, especially for iPad apps.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
window resizing that's enabled via storyboard, from my understanding, and that was a requirement they made for iOS or iPad OS 13, I guess, or sometime in that time frame. And which makes sense now because on a Mac, you're going to want to resize windows. So you have to have kept current on best practices. But other than that, there's no reconfiguring of code.
No.
There's nothing else going on. It literally, like you said, is check a box, say, yes, put it in the Mac App Store. And if you have an Apple Silicon powered Mac, you can run iPhone and iPad apps, which
very
is
little or almost no app cleanup is going to be required from the iPad front. The additionally, they brought back an emulator. They brought back Rosetta, which was originally written by Transitive, and it was eventually, as a company that was bought by IBM, but eventually it converts x86 code to 64-bit ARM code on the fly. It's a just-in-time system. How well it's going to work?
Yeah.
I mean, they showed a couple of demos. It says that, they had some, demos. Everything looks great in the demo, right? But so we don't know how really, in theory, how well that's going to work, but it's there. So that will address a lot of app gaps for some people that need certain things that will take time to port. The major need of porting stuff, in addition to the Cocoa stuff, which is there, is Catalyst. Now they've expanded Catalyst considerably. Catalyst, as we know, is the native iOS APIs ported to Mac OS.
right.
Also, so all that stuff will run in what they call container process. So it's a type of virtualization that the iPad, the ported iPad environments that will take advantage of all the Mac user interfaces and stuff like that. That will run in essentially a virtualization container. And we already have seen evidence of stuff like that in Big Sur. You've got Apple Maps and a bunch of other utilities and programs that Apple has ported from iPad to run on the Mac.
Yeah, Apple Messages, I think, is the biggest example there, right?
Yes.
They finally have brought over all the interactions and the screen effects and everything else short of iMessage apps to the Mac, and they've done it through a Catalyst app.
Yeah, so I think Catalyst is going to be really the future platform where, because if you think about where development priorities lie in terms of consolidating code bases and all that stuff, yeah, the big Cocoa apps, they're going to be here for a while, but I even see companies like Microsoft moving potential code base using Catalyst. If you think about stuff like Outlook, right? Outlook was the most crusty app out of Mac Office.
Right.
I see them potentially, and they didn't show Outlook, by the way, in the demo. They showed Excel and they showed Word, right?
Yeah. Oh, and they showed PowerPoint too.
And they showed PowerPoint. But Outlook is utterly crusty and horrible on the Mac. I see them absolutely using Catalyst to port Outlook from the iPad to provide that. And you could see Google potentially moving Gmail and some of their other apps the Catalyst. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer for them to do that, in my opinion.
I would hope so. Reading through developer responses yesterday and just looking at Twitter and getting a feel for the overall attitude towards the improvements, because when Mac Catalyst first launched last year, it didn't get really a warm welcome. There were quite a lot of issues and APIs that weren't available to developers and tools that just weren't there. And so there was a lot of upset developers when it launched. And this year, the entire narrative around it is, this is what we wanted last year. Thank you. We can make great Mac apps now using Catalyst. And so I really, truly am looking forward to seeing what developers do with their iPad apps and converting them, not only for Apple Silicon apps, but also there's a lot of us that still have Intel powered Macs around that this will work on, right? Catalyst apps still will work on that. And so we'll get to take advantage of some of that work and effort by developers.
This is the future API platform, right?
Absolutely. I've seen that. That sentiment is very strong in the developer community.
But as they build out capabilities in iPad and iPad OS over time, iPad and Mac OS will have more and more shared APIs. They're going to have more and more in common, and the distinction between the two environments is going to be blurred or non-existent over time.
Yeah, it kind of already is with the interface redesign we've seen applied to iOS, iPadOS, and now macOS Big Sur. Everything is a little bit more touch friendly. There's a very streamlined approach to the interface across the entire lineup now, where Mac was definitely Mac, and iOS and iPadOS had their own look and feel. And this year they've merged quite a bit, and I think consumers will see that later this fall when all of this launches and becomes finally available. So speaking of consumers, what does this switch away from Intel to Apple Silicon actually mean for consumers now and going into the future?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we're going to see a taste of this in Big Sur for Intel, right? For those of us who haven't gone out and we bought our Macs recently. I just bought a 16-incher MacBook for work a couple of months ago, and the great machine. I have Big Sur running on it now. As developers start to port iPad Macs over, well, guess what? They won't just land on the ARM processor architecture. They're going to land on the Intel version of Big Sur as well. So they'll cross-compile to both targets,
Yep.
and we'll see iPad apps start to land on Intel, and you'll be able to run them on Big Sur, and we'll get a better taste of what these ARM future Macs are going to look like on our Intel machines. And I think that for consumers going forward, as we start to transit and buy machines like this, we will see improvements in power consumption. These machines are going to become more lightweight. Hopefully, they'll chew up less. They'll be less heat intensive. And so there'll be lots of benefits, right? And I think we may also see hybrid. Look, we haven't heard anything about the Apple TV yet. What they're going to do with that box.
Right.
My fantasy box for Apple TV is literally that developer Mac that's coming out. A developer Mac with with a cool game controller and the ability to run iPad and Mac apps on a television. With the Apple Mac interface, with the Apple TV interface as kind of like a media center. You could theoretically build a device like that now. With the parts that they have on hand. So there's all kinds of interesting integrations that they can have. But if you're a full-blown Apple customer, right? You got an iPhone, you got an iPad, and you got a Mac, and you got a watch. Very tight integration, that we have to look forward to.
Yeah, I don't think so. The biggest question here is: do you wait? Or do you go and buy a Mac if you need one right now? Or do you wait for this fall 2020 end of the year Apple Silicon powered Mac or two Macs that are going to be released? There's some speculation that in 24-inch iMac as well as a MacBook, 12-inch MacBook are going to be the launch devices. I don't know anything about the validity of those.
I don't see any reason why we should be waiting. I mean,
Yeah.
because Big Sur runs on Intel also.
Yep.
So, and I see anything that's ported is going to be ported to Intel as well. There's no reason why a developer shouldn't flip a compiler switch and say, yeah, you know what, make it distribute it for Intel as well. I mean, that's just revenue stream that they can get for doing effectively nothing, right? So I think that the Intel chip, it's going to be he said it's going to be a 2-year transition process, right?
Right.
So if you are, if you're one of those guys that uses a Pro and you are chewing up TV, 4K video code, you're doing rendering, all that kind of stuff. Apple Silicon is not going to solve your problems in the immediate sense, right? So
Right.
I think it'll be a few years before we start to see Apple Silicon systems that are rival the power of the absolute most powerful, fastest things. I mean, look, there are Macs out there that have terabytes of RAM on them. I mean, I've never even seen an ARM chip address that much memory, right? In the field, even in cloud environments where Microsoft is deploying ARM servers on Azure, right? and those are systems they develop with Qualcomm, right? So those are in the rare right now. They're out there. They exist. Microsoft is using them for some of their platform as a service stuff. For microservices and things internally. But this is this is going to be a completely new territory for just about everybody out there.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see any reason in waiting. If you need a new Mac right now, just buy an Intel Mac. There's speculation that and actually Tim Cook said it yesterday during the keynote, that they have Intel powered Mac updates in their pipeline, which should be coming soon. Either wait a month or two to see if they announce them relatively soon, or go ahead and upgrade now. Don't wait for this ARM powered Mac, in only because we don't really know what pricing is going to be like at this point. Is it going to be more expensive as tooling costs rise for the initial batch, first early adopter devices?
I don't see these things being cheaper. They're not going to be cheaper.
No, they're not going to be any cheaper at all. It's Apple, right? Plus, we don't know what the growing pains are for software. All of this sounds good, but looking back at that Microsoft demo, in Word, they clicked on one image and dragged it around a body of text. In Excel, they clicked on 2 cells and showed graphs updating. And in PowerPoint, they just showed PowerPoint. It could have been a screenshot for all we know. There wasn't, it was cool. Yep. It was great. It was running on it, but the extent of those ports, we don't know. And we don't know how well it's going to work yet. And there will be issues on launch day. I guarantee it. This app doesn't work. 32-bit apps are now officially done for good.
They've been done since Catalina. They did that on purpose. So
right. That was a easing into this transition.
And all the carbon APIs are gone. You don't have access to them.
There's going to be huge growing pains for the first few months as Apple and developers work through everything. Look at the launch of Mac Catalyst last year. Developers said, yeah, it's okay, but it's half-baked. Took them a year to get it right. I kind of expect that same thing with this transition and apps and programs running and developers having all of the tools that they need in order to make everything work. Although it appears, in watching the State of the Union yesterday and the keynote and looking at developer response, a lot of the tools are there. There's going to be stuff that's not thought of. It just is the way this kind of stuff goes,
Yeah, I think it's going to be, like I said, he said 2 years. Yeah. 2 years is a long time in the developer universe. It really is quite a bit of time that they have to get this done. And 2 years from now, does he mean all of our systems will be this, including our top performing,
Yeah. I mean, and that's the impression I got from just how it was framed and when he was talking about it, because he was addressing specifically hardware at that moment. But you have to take the whole picture into account here. And it's not only hardware. Does that mean the Mac Pro, the $6,000-$8,000 Mac Pro will be ARM powered within 2 years? That would be quite a feat, I think, if that happens. But also it's ironing out the APIs and getting everything running smoothly. It is, the big picture there. So one last point, and then we'll wrap this up. Is this really going to be better than Intel for not only consumers and business users, but Apple?
So I think, I've written about the Intel architecture being on its last legs for a long time. And it's been a very resilient chip because it's been, compatibility has always been the primary concern with Intel, right? I mean, in theory, you can still run DOS apps from the 1980s and 90s as long as you use virtualization technology in modern x86 chips, right? So you had that full library of software compatibility going back 40 years with Intel, right? We haven't really thrown the babies out with bathwater in any part of this thing. We've switched operating systems. We went from 16-bit to 32-bit to 64-bit. We did a lot of those things. We added virtualization technology, all that kind of stuff, pipelining, multi-threading, all that crap. But at the end of the day, the Wintel platform has been the primary platform that we've been dealing with for the last 40 years. And it hasn't, we've increased our capabilities, increased amount of RAM, amount of processors, improved bus technology. But again, we've been dragging all our cruft with us all this time. This is an opportunity to do a reset, to say, you know what, now we're finally going to go to a new platform. We're going to get rid of all the old cruft. We're going to go use all new stuff. We're going to use all new development software. Look, you can see how Apple's pushing Swift over its older technologies like Objective-C and some of the other things, rapid development technologies, advanced development environments. I think the consumers will benefit from the fact that developers will be able to retool and finally use modern things, and we'll see the benefits of that. I think that definitely ARM is at scale, once we understand how to, deal with things like, yeah, you're going to have a lot more cores. You're going to have to deal with threading differently. You
Yeah.
can't just take an Intel chip optimized application and dump it on ARM and expect it to run perfectly. There may be code changes they're going to have to make, logic changes and things, so that they handle, a system that's designed for 32 cores versus an app that was designed for 4, right? So this the consumers will eventually benefit once all this stuff is fully optimized. Like I said, it's not going to be an immediate, oh my God, how awesome is this? It's going to be in 2-3 years, wow, we've really reaped the benefits of this thing finally. And it's not going to be, I think, as smooth as we like, but at the end of the day, I think it'll be a good transition for the company.
Yeah. It's not going to be a smooth transition at all on day one. But
No.
I think overall, the move makes sense. Apple's able to control its entire platform from iOS on iPhone and Apple Watch all the way through Mac. Intel's held them up quite a bit with their release schedule for new processor upgrades and updates, and it's delayed Mac releases for years,
And
for the last few years.
Let's not get away from it. The future is the App Store. The future is not these big honking old Cocoa applications. You go to some website and you pay Microsoft or Adobe, and they give you an installation binary, you double click on and you install, and now you're out of band from Apple's revenue stream. The future is App Store. Absolutely. And we'll see what happens with the regulation authorities as far as whether or not that's something they're going to be able to exclusively control going forward. We're going to see probably some government litigation. We're going to see some antitrust coming from the United States and from the European Union by the end of this summer. I mean, we're going to so Apple's future with its relationship with developers is definitely something that we're going to have to watch very closely over the next 2 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think performance-wise, the Apple Silicon has proven itself in iPad. For example, the iPad Pro line is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than most Windows laptops right now, benchmarking-wise. Seeing that transition into a full-fledged computer, though, where you're running multiple apps at the same time, the benefit of iPad is you're running one app, and there's all resources and all power are dedicated to that app. And so seeing what Apple does with that transition, but they have a good track record. I'm excited to see what happens. It's like we said, it's going to have some growing pains. There's going to be a transition period that's going to be bumpy, but I think in the end, this move makes complete sense for Apple. And I think it will be better, not only for consumers, but for enterprise users as well. And I think that's probably a good place to stop, Jason. What do you think?
I agree.
All right. I'm Jason Cipriani.
And I'm Jason Perlow.
And this is Jason Squared. Make sure to check out more of our work at zdnet.com.